The winter of 1986 settled over Rockford, Illinois like a heavy blanket, the kind of cold that didn't just sting, it lingered. The morning air felt metallic, sharp against the lungs, and even the sun seemed muted, hanging low behind a curtain of pale gray clouds. Rockford was no stranger to harsh winters, but that year felt different. Locals would later say the cold carried a strange stillness, an uneasy quiet, almost as if the season itself sensed what was coming. But in those early days of December, before tragedy took its first step toward the Whitford family, Rockford was simply a working-class Midwestern city getting ready for the holidays. Lights went up on porches. The smell of wood-burning stoves drifted through neighborhoods. Families rushed through grocery store aisles buying ingredients for Christmas dinners. Children pressed their noses to frosted windows, waiting for the first real snowfall. And 20-year-old Hannah Whitford moved through all of it with a kind of gentle presence that made people notice her without knowing why. She wasn't the loudest, the brightest, or the boldest person in Rockford, but she had a quiet warmth, something soft, steady, and deeply human. Before she became the center of one of Illinois' most haunting cold cases, she was just Hannah, a daughter, a sister, a young woman trying to figure out her place in the world. She lived with her parents, Daniel and Margaret Whitford, in a modest beige house on Maplewood Avenue, a place filled with old photographs, crocheted blankets, and the kind of warmth you only get from a home built over decades of shared meals and late-night conversations. Hannah was the middle child. Older brother Michael was in the army, younger sister Rachel still in high school. And even though the family didn't have much, they had love, and they had each other. Hannah had always been the quiet one, thoughtful, observant, sensitive in ways people didn't always understand. As a child, she could spend hours drawing near the living room window, sketching the branches of their maple tree in every season. As a teenager, she wrote poems in the back pages of her school notebooks, small, handwritten fragments about sunsets and silence and the ache of growing up. She dreamed of being an artist, maybe a teacher someday. Something gentle. Something that let her make a mark without having to take up too much space. People often remembered her eyes first, soft brown, warm, and always carrying something unspoken behind them. A depth, a question, a longing for something just out of reach. At 20, Hannah worked part-time at Jefferson Public Library, shelving books, helping visitors find old historical records, and organizing the children's reading events. She loved the quiet, loved the smell of paperback pages and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Loved recommending books to people who didn't know what they wanted until she placed something in their hands. She was taking evening classes at Rock Valley College, Intro to Art History, Basic English Composition, and a psychology course she'd grown unexpectedly fascinated with. Her dream was to apply to Illinois State the following fall, get a degree in education, and teach elementary art. She had plans. They weren't big, loud, or grand, but they were hers, and she held them close. People who knew Hannah said she was gentle but lonely, the kind of girl who loved deeply but quietly. She had a small circle of friends, mostly girls she'd grown up with, and a brief relationship that ended earlier that year when her boyfriend moved away for work. She wasn't looking for anything new, at least not then. She was focused on school, on the library, on helping her mom prepare for Christmas. In the weeks before her death, nothing seemed unusual. No dramatic changes, no signs of danger, no enemies, no secrets big enough to kill for. But looking back, a few people remembered small moments that didn't make sense until much later. Her co-worker at the library, Elaine Pearson, said Hannah had seemed distracted that last week, not in a heavy emotional way, but as if she were thinking hard about something she couldn't put into words. Her younger sister, Rachel, remembered seeing Hannah staring out the kitchen window late one night, long after everyone else was asleep. When Rachel asked what she was doing, Hannah simply said, "Listening." Listening to what? Rachel never found out. There was also a strange incident 2 days before the murder, something the Whitford family never talked much about. Hannah had come home 30 minutes late from her shift. Not unusual, but she looked unsettled, pale, like she had run part of the way. Her mother asked if everything was all right. Hannah hesitated just a moment, then nodded. Yeah, just tired. But she didn't eat dinner, she didn't watch TV with the family, she didn't go straight to bed either. She sat at her desk writing something, then tore the page out, crumpled it, and hid it in her coat pocket. Nobody ever found that note. Nobody ever knew what she wrote. It was one of many small mysteries that would later become part of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that would take more than 3 decades to solve. In the small hours of December 12, 1986, Hannah woke early. Too early. The sky was still black, her alarm hadn't gone off, the house was silent, her breath made small clouds in the cold air of her bedroom. She sat up, looked toward the window, and for a moment, she froze. There was something strange about the way she hesitated that morning. Something in the silence. Something in the way her feet stayed planted on the floor, unmoving, for almost a minute before she finally stood. Some people later speculated she'd had a nightmare. Others thought she'd heard something outside. Others believed she was already afraid of someone, even if she couldn't admit it. But the truth is simple. Nobody knows what stirred inside her that morning. What is known as this: by sunrise, she was her usual self, quiet, warm, moving through the house with practiced familiarity. She helped her mom with breakfast, kissed her father on the cheek before he left for work, and promised Rachel she'd help her wrap presents that weekend. It should have been an ordinary day. The start of a weekend leading into the holidays. Nothing more, nothing tragic. But fate was already watching, already choosing its moment. In the most painful stories, the final hours look normal from the outside. They look safe, soft, calm. And that was the haunting part about Hannah Whitford's life. Her last day began peacefully, quietly, gently. A day where the cold hung in the air, where the sky glowed pale, where nothing felt out of place. A day where she smiled at her mom before stepping out the front door. A day where she walked toward the bus stop with her scarf wrapped tight, her breath fogging in the air, her mind drifting the way it always did. A day that should have ended with her returning home, but never did. Because somewhere between that library, that bus stop, that quiet walk across Rockford's frozen streets, someone was waiting. Someone who knew her path, knew her routine, knew her softness, knew the exact moment to strike. And by sundown, Rockford, Illinois would no longer be the same city it had been when she woke up that morning. Hannah's story was about to shift from a life still unfolding to a mystery that would echo for decades. And the first crack in that mystery came just after dusk, when a jogger found something lying beneath the old bridge on Auburn Street. But that moment belongs to the next chapter. The final day of Hannah Whitford's life began with a kind of quiet most people wouldn't have noticed. But those who remembered her, those who later replayed the day in their minds again and again, they recalled something different in the air. Not danger, not fear, just a stillness, a pause before the world changed. December 12, 1986, a Friday. The kind of cold Midwestern morning where the sky hangs low and colorless, as if the world has been desaturated. The kind of cold that makes the breath linger and the lungs sting. Rockford was half asleep under a layer of frost, and the wind that cut between the houses on Maplewood Avenue carried that eerie whistle it sometimes had in deep winter. Hannah stepped outside just after 7 a.m. Her scarf was wrapped high over her mouth, her gloves thick, her coat buttoned to the collar. She waved to her mother from the porch. Just a small wave, barely visible through the fog of her breath. And then she began walking toward the bus stop. Her parents didn't see anything unusual. Her sister didn't feel any shift in the air. If anything, it felt like a perfectly ordinary morning. But later, many would wonder, did she hesitate at the door? Did she sense someone watching her? Did she feel something she couldn't name? Because there were 2 details that became important later. A neighbor saw her pause halfway down the street, turning her head slightly as if listening to something behind her. And the mailman, who arrived early that morning, double-gloved and red-faced from the cold, remembered Hannah walking faster than usual. Not running, not afraid, but hurried, unsure. The kind of hurried someone makes when they're trying to get away from a thought rather than a person. She reached the bus stop at 7:18 a.m. The bus arrived 3 minutes later. She boarded, sat in her usual seat, the 3rd row on the right by the window, and pulled her sketchbook from her bag. The driver remembered her glancing at the rearview mirror once, just once, with a faint crease in her brow. Faint, barely noticeable, almost nothing. But almost nothing often becomes everything in these stories. She arrived at Jefferson Public Library at 7:52 a.m., greeted the morning staff, hung her coat in the back room, and began sorting returned books. She hummed sometimes when she worked, but that morning she didn't. She moved more quietly, more inwardly, more like she was thinking through something she hadn't yet accepted. At 9:15 a.m., she helped a mother find books for her toddler. At 10:03 a.m., she restocked the local history shelf. At 11 a.m., she took her break, tea, not coffee, like always. Nothing alarming, nothing strange. Nothing that foreshadowed the horror waiting just hours away. But at 11:42 a.m., she stepped outside behind the library for a breath of air. Her co-worker, Elaine, saw her through the window. Hannah's posture was stiff, her body angled slightly toward the alley. She wasn't smoking. She never smoked. She wasn't pacing. She didn't pace. She just stood there, motionless, staring out toward the narrow street that curved behind the building. When Elaine came to ask if she was okay, Hannah startled, actually flinched. "Oh yeah," she said quickly. "I'm fine, just tired." Her voice had a tremble Elaine didn't recognize. Years later, Elaine told investigators, "If I had known what was coming, I would have pulled her back inside. But we never know what's coming." Hannah finished her shift at 2 p.m. She planned to go straight home. Her sister wanted help wrapping gifts that evening. She put on her coat, thanked her boss, reached the front door, and paused. It was subtle, barely a breath, but she paused, as if she felt something waiting on the other side of the door, as if an instinct whispered to her, "Not yet." She stepped outside anyway. The bus ride home should have been uneventful. The passengers that afternoon were the same regulars: an older woman with grocery bags, 2 high school kids joking too loudly, a factory worker dozing near the back. But none of them remembered seeing anything unusual. Yet one detail emerged later. Hannah switched seats. She never switched seats. She moved from the window to the aisle. No one could explain why. When she got off the bus at 2:27 p.m., the sun was already beginning to drop. Winters in Illinois are like that. Daylight slips away early, swallowed by long shadows and the glow of faraway headlights. She walked her normal route home, 3 blocks, past the old brick church, past the empty baseball field, past the narrower side street where the trees bent inward like archways. A witness, a teenage boy walking his dog, said he saw a car parked near that side street. A dark-colored sedan, older model, engine running. But he didn't see the driver, didn't think anything of it. People never think anything of it until there's a reason to. Hannah reached Maplewood Avenue at 2:35 p.m. Her house was only 5 doors down, 5 doors, 5 driveways, 5 front lawns, a 1-minute walk. But she never made it to the house. Neighbors later said they heard nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sound of running. Just silence. Cold, flat silence. At 2:43 p.m., a neighbor saw her walking, head down, hands in pockets, 2 houses away from home. At 2:44 p.m., a car was seen pulling away from the curb. At 2:47 p.m., Hannah's mother looked out the window, expecting to see her daughter's brown coat rounding the corner. She never appeared. By 3:10 p.m., worry set in. By 3:30 p.m., fear. By 4:05 p.m., police were called. And by sunrise the next morning, Hannah's disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was a nightmare. Because at dawn, a jogger found something beneath the Auburn Street Bridge. Something pale, something still, something the river had not claimed but the cold had preserved. A hand. A human hand. Hannah's hand. The rest of her body lay tangled in the reeds just below the embankment, frozen in the posture of someone who had fought hard against a violence no one had seen coming. The final day of her life had ended in the cold. Alone, afraid, stolen. And Rockford, Illinois, would never be the same. But discovering her body was only the beginning. The beginning of a case that would splinter the community, torment her family, and haunt detectives for more than 30 years. The real nightmare started after the discovery, and that story belongs to the next part. Sure, here is your text, rewritten exactly as you sent it, unchanged with no commentary. The discovery of Hannah Whitford's body would become one of those moments people in Rockford remembered with unsettling clarity: where they were, what the morning smelled like, how the air felt too thin and too cold, as if even the winter itself recoiled from what had been found. It began just after dawn on December 13, 1986. The Auburn Street Bridge was quiet at sunrise, the sky above it pale and washed out, a thin sheet of orange bleeding slowly across the horizon. The river beneath it flowed sluggishly, not yet frozen, but heavy with ice, its surface rippling with that dark metallic sheen winter water has. A man named James O'Malley, a 31-year-old factory worker and early morning jobber, was running his usual route along the path that paralleled the water. He almost didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He was focused on the sound of his footsteps, the cold burning his lungs, the fog rising in delicate breaths. But as he approached the underside of the bridge, a place where debris often collected, something stopped him. It wasn't a movement, not a sound, just a shape. A pale shape caught between the reeds and the half-frozen mud near the embankment. He took a few more steps, slowed, squinted into the low morning light. At first he thought it was a discarded mannequin. Kids sometimes threw strange things into the river, but mannequins didn't have hair matted with frost. Mannequins didn't wear winter coats, and mannequins didn't have fingers curled into tight, desperate shapes. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs. No, he whispered to himself. He stepped closer, slow, careful steps, every instinct in him clashing with the part that knew he had to confirm what his brain already understood. The closer he got, the more the awful truth revealed itself. A hand, not plastic, not fake, a real human hand. Pale, stiff, the skin bluish from the cold. He stumbled backward, breath shaking, stomach churning. He fumbled with his gloves, yanked one off, and reached for the payphone at the corner of Auburn and Court Street. His voice trembled as he told the dispatcher, "There's someone under the bridge. I think she's dead." Minutes later, squad cars rolled in, red and blue lights slicing through the gray morning. Officers jogged down the embankment, boots crunching over frozen weeds, breath puffing in frantic clouds. The first deputy on scene knelt beside the body, knees sinking slightly into icy mud, and with a heavy, steady breath, gently removed the frost-covered reeds. What they saw carved itself into their memory. A young woman, lying partly on her side, coat torn at the sleeve, hair stiff with frozen river water. Her face was turned slightly away, eyes half open, frozen into an expression that was impossibly haunting. Fear mixed with the final, exhausted attempt to fight. It took less than 5 minutes for one of the officers to whisper the name. Hannah. It's Hannah Whitford. Someone ran to the patrol car to radio dispatch. Someone whispered a quiet prayer. Someone else vomited near the rocks. By the time the crime scene unit arrived, the bridge had become a hive of controlled chaos. Officers moved methodically, carefully photographing everything. The disturbed snow, the drag marks near the bank, the imprint of tire tracks along the service path beside the bridge. And the hand, the way her hand had frozen mid-clutch, as if holding on to something that wasn't there. Sheriff's deputies placed yellow markers along the ground. Pathologists arrived with insulated gear. Detectives ducked their heads beneath the bridge, voices low but tense. The river moved quietly beside them, uncaring, swallowing secrets in its dark currents. The crime scene details. The medical examiner, Dr. Crane, arrived at 7:41 a.m. His breath hung in the air as he knelt beside the body, his gloved hands steady but heavy with dread. He confirmed what everyone already felt deep in their bones. The girl beneath the bridge had not died in the river. She had been placed there, dragged, judging by the parallel streaks in the mud, moved post-mortem, suggested by the stiffness in her limbs, positioned deliberately, her coat half-draped, not washed away. "Look," Dr. Crane said quietly, pointing to the shallow frost clinging to the edges of her clothing. She wasn't in the water long. The cold preserved her faster than the river ever could. Her cause of death wouldn't be confirmed until autopsy, but early signs were visible. Bruising around the neck, abrasions on her forearms, a small fracture along the bridge of her nose. Someone had grabbed her. Someone had fought her. And someone had silenced her. A detective held up torn coat sleeve and whispered, "She fought hard." Just a few feet away, wedged between two stones, they found something else. A silver charm bracelet. It was delicate, with 3 tiny charms, a star, a heart, and a book. Her family would later confirm it was hers, a gift from her sister for her 20th birthday. The bracelet was frozen into a half circle, stiff as wire, but intact. The call to the family, At 8:12 a.m., 2 officers were sent to the Whitford residence. Margaret answered the door with the desperate hope every missing person's mother clings to, the unnatural brightness in her eyes, the forced steadiness in her voice as she asked, "Did you find her? Did someone see her?" The moment the officers removed their hats, her face crumpled, her knees buckled, her hands shook violently. A sound escaped her, something raw, broken, barely human. Daniel caught her just before she collapsed. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched. His eyes reddened instantly, but he didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. Rachel, Hannah's younger sister, stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the railing so hard her knuckles whitened. "No," she whispered. "No. No." When her father finally pulled her into his arms, she sobbed with a kind of grief that stained the walls of that house forever. The media erupts. By noon, every local news station had arrived. By evening, Chicago outlets were reporting it. By the next morning, the headline blared, "Rockford woman found dead. Police suspect foul play." People stopped one another in grocery store aisles. Cars slowed near the bridge. Candlelight vigils were hastily arranged. Parents held their children tighter. Hannah wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a nameless victim in a big city. She was someone's girl. The girl who shelved books at the library. The girl who tutored children after school. The girl who always walked with her hands in her coat pockets. Her death felt personal, because it was. The first investigative break. Detectives combed the area beneath the bridge meticulously, and that's when they found something crucial. Half buried in the frozen dirt, pressed into the mud a few feet from her body, was a partial impression of a boot print. Deep, heavy, size 11, maybe 12. Work boot, distinctive worn tread on the heel. The same kind of print would later be found on the path she walked every day. But in 1986, lacking the forensic power we take for granted today, the print was more of a haunting clue than a headline. Still, detectives knew what it meant. Someone strong. Someone who worked with their hands. Someone confident enough to attack in daylight. Someone who knew the area. A local. Almost certainly a local. But they didn't know the name yet. Not then. What they knew, what they feared, was that Hannah hadn't just stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had stalked her path, waited, chosen their moment, and now that someone had to be found. Fast. But Rockford was about to learn the hardest truth of all. Finding a killer in the first 48 hours is possible. Finding a killer after the trail grows cold is painful. Finding a killer who leaves almost nothing behind can take a lifetime. In Hannah's case, it would take 31 years. And the nightmare that followed her discovery, the suspects, the theories, the public fear, the investigative mistakes, all of it begins in the next part. The investigation into the murder of Hannah Whitford began in the cold, gray light of a December morning, one of those mornings where even the air seemed to hesitate, as if the world knew something terrible had happened. Rockford police moved quickly, but speed could never match the weight of fear spreading through the community. A young woman, quiet, gentle, deeply loved, had been taken violently, and whoever did it had vanished into the frozen silence. Detective Frank Calder, the lead investigator assigned to the case, was a man known for his patience and methodical mind. Heavyset, mid-40s, with a face carved by years of difficult cases, he arrived at the Auburn Street Bridge crime scene with a grim determination. He crouched beside the embankment where Hannah had been found, studying every detail, the placement of the body, the torn sleeve, the cold stiffness of her fingers. He didn't speak at first. Didn't bark orders, didn't demand explanations. He simply looked, absorbing the scene with the kind of quiet intensity that made younger officers stand still without being told. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. This wasn't random. Those words would define the next 3 decades of speculation. The autopsy. By late afternoon, Hannah's body was at the coroner's office. The autopsy confirmed many of the suspicions detectives had gathered at the scene. Dr. Crane, the medical examiner, prepared his report with a heaviness that hung in every sentence. Cause of death, manual strangulation. Time of death, likely between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. Injuries, bruising along the neck, small fracture on the nasal bone, abrasions on left shoulder and right forearm, signs of a struggle, especially defensive wounds on the hands. She had fought hard, but there was no evidence of sexual assault, no knife wounds, no binding. This confused investigators. Most murders of young women in small towns followed familiar patterns. This case did not. Dr. Crane wrote something in his report that echoed like a warning. She was subdued quickly, overpowered. This suggests a physically strong offender, likely male, familiar with hand-to-hand control. Someone capable, someone confident, someone who didn't need a weapon. And, most chilling of all, someone who likely planned this. The critical early hours. Rockford detectives canvassed every house on Maplewood Avenue. They knocked on doors until their knuckles bruised, trying to find anyone who had seen a car, a stranger, a gesture, a sound. They found fragments, pieces, hints. A neighbor saw a dark sedan parked near the corner at 2:40 p.m. A mail carrier swore he saw someone walking behind Hannah earlier that morning. A teenage girl heard a car door slam around the same time. Hannah disappeared. A man across the street reported seeing a figure standing near the Whitford driveway the week before. But nothing solid, nothing definitive, nothing actionable. Detective Calder stood in the middle of Maplewood Avenue at sunset that night, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. Whoever did this, he whispered, knew exactly when to strike. The first suspects. Within days, investigators developed a list of potential suspects, men who knew Hannah, lived nearby, or had criminal records in the area. Some were hopeful leads, others were desperation, but each man had a story. One, Mark Hendricks, the ex-boyfriend. Mark and Hannah dated briefly earlier that year. He was shy, soft-spoken, and visibly heartbroken when detectives questioned him. He had an airtight alibi, at work from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. 7 co-workers confirmed it. Still, rumors spread, as they often do when small towns lose innocence. Some people still whispered his name years later, but he was innocent. 2. Carl Simmons, the local drifter. Carl lived out of his truck, sometimes near the bridge, sometimes near the old mill. He had a record, minor theft, trespassing, but nothing violent. Police found him 2 towns over. He fully cooperated. He cried when they told him what happened. He wasn't the one. 3. Henry Wallace, the reclusive neighbor. He lived alone, kept to himself, never smiled. Neighbors described him as odd and unfriendly. Detectives questioned him thoroughly. His boots didn't match. His alibi was weak but supported by logs from his workplace. He remained suspicious, but the evidence wasn't enough. 4. The man in the dark sedan. This was the ghost of the investigation, the shadow that moved through every theory, the stranger who appeared in almost every recollection, but whose face no one could clearly remember. Descriptions varied, mid-30s or maybe older, thin or medium build. Dark hair or wearing a cap, a mustache, possibly, driving a dark sedan, maybe brown, maybe blue. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. No name, no plates, no trail. Detectives sent sketches to nearby towns, ran checks, interviewed mechanics, investigated used car lots. Nothing. He became the case's most haunting unanswered question, the library connection. When detectives began piecing together Hannah's final day, they focused heavily on her workplace. Libraries are quiet, public places, ideal for observing someone without being noticed. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing a man browsing near the back section the week Hannah disappeared. A tall man, wearing a dark coat, always alone, always quiet, never checking out books. Elaine, Hannah's coworker, believed she saw the same man on the day Hannah took that unusual break behind the building. But no one got his name. No one got his face. No one even saw him clearly. Investigators reviewed the library's sign-in sheets, the guest logs, the late return slips. Nothing pointed to a suspicious outsider. Still, Calder felt something there. Something subtle, something that tugged at him. Hannah was scared, he told his partner. Someone made her scared, that someone was watching her before the last day. The mistakes of 1986. Cases from the 80s often suffered not from lack of effort, but from lack of technology. There were no security cameras near the bridge, no DNA testing beyond rudimentary blood typing, no digital fingerprint databases, no cell phone triangulation, no genetic genealogy. All detectives had were a boot print, a torn sleeve, a charm bracelet, a few faint eyewitness accounts, a terrified family, and a dead girl. They interviewed more than 120 people in the first 2 weeks. They followed dozens of tips. They re-interviewed neighbors repeatedly. They dug through dumpsters, garages, cars, and wooded areas. By the 3rd week, the case had gained statewide attention. By the 5th week, the leads began to fade. By March, the file grew cold. And it broke Detective Calder. He carried the failure like a weight in his chest. He retired early, in 1991, 5 years after Hannah's murder. Some believed the case never left him. Others said he visited Hannah's grave every December for the rest of his life. He died in 2004, never knowing the truth. The community years after Hannah's murder changed Rockford more than anyone wanted to admit. Parents became fearful. Teens walked home in groups. Women avoided the area around the bridge. For years, people locked their doors earlier than normal. The sound of a car idling in the street became something suspicious. Strangers in the library were met with quiet, cautious glances. The Whitford family struggled to move forward. Margaret never reopened Hannah's bedroom. Daniel blamed himself for not picking her up that day. Rachel developed severe anxiety, particularly around winter. And yet, time moved. As it always does. Years passed, neighbors moved away, children grew up, the city changed. Hannah's case became a sad story older residents told newcomers, a cautionary tale for daughters walking alone, a memory preserved in whispers. But the truth, the real truth, did not fade. It sat in a box, on a shelf, in an evidence room, quiet, but waiting. Waiting for science to catch up, waiting for someone with relentless curiosity, waiting for a moment when the world was finally ready to look back into the dark. That moment would come in 2017, more than 30 years after Hannah's death, and it would begin, not with a new witness or a confession, but with a tiny fragment of evidence overlooked in 1986, a single strand of hair, untested, untouched, locked in an envelope. The key to everything. Cold cases don't freeze all at once. They cool slowly, painfully, piece by piece, year by year. A fading tip here, a dead lead there, a detective retiring, a witness moving away, memories dissolving like footprints in melting snow. By the time 1987 arrived, the investigation into the murder of Hannah Whitford had already begun its long descent into silence. Not because people didn't care. Rockford cared deeply. Not because detectives weren't competent, they were, for their time. Not because the killer was clever, though he was. It was because the world in 1986 simply wasn't equipped to catch him. No DNA, no genealogy, no digital anything. Just paper, interviews, and instinct. Instinct had screamed that a monster walked among them, but instinct alone cannot convict. 1987 to 1990, the first years of silence. The Whitford family lived those early years like people walking through fog. Their house grew quiet, too quiet. Christmas lights stayed in boxes. Hannah's room stayed untouched, the way she left it. Sketchbook on her desk, a half-finished drawing tucked under her pillow. Her sister Rachel became withdrawn, skipping dances, avoiding late classes, jumping whenever a car slowed near her. Fear became her shadow. Her father Daniel spent his weekends walking the path Hannah took home from the library, stopping often, staring at empty sidewalks the way grieving parents do, hoping for answers that never arrived. Her mother, Margaret, held on to guilt the way some people hold on to breath, convinced that if she had insisted on picking Hannah up that day, or if she had paid closer attention to her daughter's strange behavior earlier that week, maybe things would have been different. That kind of guilt never fades. It settles into the bones. By 1990, the case file had stopped growing. Detectives reviewed it once a year, the way one dusts a shelf, just a glance, just a hope. Just a reminder that Hannah's name still mattered. But no new evidence came, no one confessed, nothing broke. The 1990s, America changes, the case doesn't alert. The 1990s brought big leaps in forensic science. DNA became the miracle word, solving cases that once seemed impossible. But not Hannah's. Not yet. When Rockford PD reopened the case briefly in 1996 to test available samples, they ran into a brick wall. The evidence was too degraded. The biological material was too small, and the technology wasn't advanced enough. The single hair recovered from her coat, the one officers assumed belonged to Hannah herself, was logged but never tested. It was considered non-probative. Forensic priority was given to cases with sexual assault, fresh blood, or clear suspects. So the hair sat on a shelf, in a box, waiting. Meanwhile, life in Rockford continued. The Auburn Street Bridge, once a quiet crossing, became symbolic. Parents pointed at it when warning their children. Joggers avoided early morning runs under it. Teenagers dared each other to walk there at night. Time turned the bridge into a ghost of the past. A place that carried whispers. The 2000s, new eyes, old pain. By 2003, a new generation of officers was working the Rockford PD. They grew up hearing about Hannah. Her story became local lore, a tragic puzzle no one knew how to solve. One of those new officers was Detective Laura Merrick, a sharp, determined woman in her early 30s who joined the force with a reputation for seeing details others missed. In 2004, she requested permission to review the Whitford case. Her supervisor approved it, mainly out of courtesy, not expectation. Laura spent 6 months digging through every page, every statement, every photograph. She interviewed old detectives, revisited Maplewood Avenue, walked the same route Hannah had taken, stood beneath the Auburn Street Bridge just after dawn, the same hour Hannah's body had been found. But she hit the same walls Calder did, same incomplete stories, same vague descriptions, same dead ends. Still, she found something the old detectives hadn't noticed. A missing item. A torn page in Hannah's journal, the last page. No one knew when it had been torn out, or why, or what it said. It wasn't evidence. Not in the official sense. But Laura couldn't let it go. That missing page means something, she told the captain. But without new leads, the file closed again in 2005. Detective Merrick never forgot it. Even after she transferred to a different unit, she checked the evidence box once a year, just to make sure everything was still there. She didn't know she was guarding the golden key of the entire case. The Whitford family in the new millennium. Time did not heal the Whitfords. It reshaped them. Margaret died in 2009, her health worn thin by grief. At her funeral, Daniel spoke with a voice that carried decades of ache. She went to her grave without knowing. No parent should. Rachel, now an adult living outside Illinois, returned home for the service. She visited Hannah's room for the first time in years. The dust smelled like memory, thick and quiet. She picked up the old sketchbook left on the desk and cried for the girl she once shared secrets with. Then she packed the room carefully. Not to erase Hannah, but to finally let the house breathe again. Daniel lived alone after that. He didn't leave Rockford, didn't move houses, didn't remarry. He woke every morning, brewed his coffee, sat in the same chair near the window, and stared at the street where he once watched Hannah walk home. His life became an echo of a single hope, that one day he'd know who took her from him. But hope, for him, was a quiet thing. A tired thing. A thing he expected to leave the world without. 2010 to 2015, something stirs. The 2010s brought a revolution in forensic science. DNA extraction improved, cold case units expanded, funding increased. And then came the true breakthrough. Genetic genealogy. A method where DNA wasn't matched to criminals, but to family trees. A method where distant cousins could lead detectives to killers. A method that changed everything. Rockford wasn't quick to jump on the trend. Budgets were thin, backlogs were long, cases piled up. But Detective Laura Merrick never let go of Hannah's file. She kept pushing, kept reminding her superiors, kept requesting reinvestigation. "Just give me the evidence," she said in 2015. "We have tools now that we didn't have before." Finally, after nearly a decade of persistence, she got the green light. The evidence box was brought down from storage, sealed envelopes opened, labels checked, and there it was, a single strand of hair, logged in 1986, preserved perfectly, and never tested. Laura stared at it, heart pounding. "That's not Hannah's," she whispered. "She had light brown hair. This is darker, shorter, coarser. This is him." She took the envelope directly to the new forensic lab Rockford had partnered with. A young forensic analyst, Dr. Ian McConnell, examined it under magnification, nodded slowly, then said the words Laura had been waiting to hear for years. "We can work with this." History shifted in that moment. The room felt heavier, as if the past, long buried, was leaning forward to listen. The testing begins. It took weeks, then months. DNA extraction is delicate, genealogy even more so. But slowly, gene by gene, the hair began to speak. A partial profile emerged. Not enough for CODIS, not enough for direct comparison, but enough for something better. Enough to upload to public genealogy databases, enough to build a family tree, enough to find the bloodline of Hannah's killer. The moment the profile hit the database, a cluster of distant matches appeared. Third cousins, fourth cousins, great-great-grandchildren of the same ancestors. A web of strangers connected by nothing but genetic memory. But within that web was a name. A man. A living man. Not someone the police ever suspected, not someone mentioned in the original investigation, not someone who knew Hannah, but someone who had been near Rockford in 1986. Someone with the right age, the right build, the right history. Someone who had blended into American life like a ghost disguised as a neighbor. For the first time in 31 years, the case burned hot again. Detective Merrick didn't sleep the night the match came through. She sat at her desk staring at the name, whispering, "I found you." But she hadn't found everything. Not yet. She had blood, she had ancestry, she had a direction. But she didn't have proof. And to get that, she needed his DNA. The DNA of a man who had lived free for 3 decades, a man who had raised a family, worked jobs, attended church, bought groceries, smiled at strangers, a man who carried no record, no suspicion, no shadow, except the one he left beneath the Auburn Street Bridge in 1986. A shadow about to be dragged into the light. The next part is where everything sharpens, where genealogy turns into truth, where a quiet man becomes a suspect, where a single DNA test breaks open a frozen case. Detective Laura Merrick had waited more than a decade for this moment. 31 years had passed since Hannah Whitford was murdered. 31 years since a quiet young woman disappeared in the cold shadow of an Illinois winter. And now, finally, there was a name, a direction, a thread to pull. Not a suspect yet. Not officially. But a genetic match, distant but unmistakable. A third cousin cluster pointing to the same ancestral branch. Hannah's killer had a family, a history, a lineage. He was no phantom. He was real, traceable, living. The name that appeared in the genealogical tree wasn't the killer's. Genealogy rarely gives the answer directly. Instead, it gave something far more powerful, the bloodline. From that line, Laura and forensic genealogist Dr. Ian McConnell began building the family's past, a sprawling map of marriages, migrations, births, and deaths spanning more than a century. Paper trails, obituaries, public marriage records, census logs, military enlistments, high school yearbooks, church baptism records, cemetery registries. Piece by piece, they built it. It took weeks. Sometimes the trail was clear. Sometimes it broke into fragments. Sometimes whole branches vanished into adoption records or surnames lost to remarriage. But slowly, the branches narrowed. They traced 4 siblings, then their sons, from 80 living male descendants down to 23, down to 11, down to 4, down to 2. 2 men alive in 2017 who fit the age bracket. 2 men who could have been in Rockford in 1986. 2 men whose DNA could link them to the hair found on Hannah's coat. One lived in Arizona, too young in 1986, eliminated. The other lived in Wisconsin, a quiet man, a retired machinist. No criminal record, no previous suspicion, never questioned, never noticed. His name was Thomas Tom R. Kincaid. Born 1952, lived in Rockford briefly in the mid-80s, worked part-time construction back then, owned a maroon sedan in 1986, moved away less than a year after Hannah's death, married twice, 2 adult children, grandfather of 3, volunteered at a veterans center, a regular man, a normal man. A man who lived small, quiet, unremarkable. But life had taught Laura something. Monsters rarely look like monsters. Sometimes they look like retirees who feed ducks at the park. Sometimes they look like men who've lived 40 years pretending their hands are clean. Surveillance, watching the ghost. Laura didn't request a warrant. Not yet. They needed confirmation before they could make a move. Instead, she assembled a small undercover team and drove north to Janesville, Wisconsin, where Kincaid now lived. The neighborhood was peaceful, tree-lined streets, children's bikes left on driveways, a dog barking somewhere behind a backyard fence. A place where people waved when you drove by. They parked 2 houses down from his small white ranch home with blue shutters. Hours passed. Then the door opened. He stepped outside. Gray hair, broad shoulders softened by age, a small limp, right leg, hands rough, thick-knuckled, the kind of hands that looked like they once belonged to a younger man capable of overpowering someone quickly. He walked to the mailbox with a slow, deliberate pace, looked around casually, not nervous, not watchful, just normal. He didn't know the past was catching up to him. The DNA collection. The problem with killers who blend in is simple. They rarely leave evidence behind. Not anymore. So detectives wait for the smallest slip. A soda can tossed in a bin, a cigarette dropped on a sidewalk, a coffee cup left in a public place. Laura and her team waited, hours, days. On the 4th day, their break arrived. Kincaid stepped outside in the morning cold wearing a flannel shirt and work gloves. He carried a small trash bag to the bin by the curb. Before tossing it in, he paused, wiped his forehead with a tissue, and dropped the tissue into the bag. Laura nudged her partner. There, that's it. They waited until evening, until the trash was officially abandoned property by law, then collected it discreetly. The tissue was carefully bagged, labeled, and placed into a secure cooler. Laura drove straight to the forensic lab. No stops, no music, no words, just a cold, tight focus in her chest. Dr. McConnell took the tissue with a raised eyebrow. "Do you think it's him?" he asked. Laura didn't hesitate. "Yes." McConnell nodded. "I'll test it tonight." The results. The moment everything shifted. The call came the next morning. Early. Too early for casual news. Laura answered her phone before the second ring. "It's him," McConnell said. His voice wasn't triumphant. It was shaken. "It's a perfect match. The DNA from the hair and the DNA from Kincaid's tissue, identical." Laura closed her eyes. A wave of adrenaline washed over her. Then dread. Then, not satisfaction but something deeper. A solemn, heavy recognition that decades of pain were about to rise from the dead. A ghost finally had a face. The arrest. Laura prepared the paperwork, the affidavit, the request for a warrant, the full genealogical explanation, the DNA match analysis, the corroborating timeline. The judge reviewed it silently. 5 minutes passed. Then he signed the warrant with a slow, deliberate stroke. "This one's been waiting too long," he said. Laura nodded. "Yes, sir." By sunset, 6 unmarked vehicles pulled into the quiet street in Janesville. Neighbors peeked through blinds as officers stepped out in jackets, bearing the insignia of Rockford PD and U.S. Marshals. Kincaid opened the door before they knocked, confused by the sudden noise. Laura stepped forward. "Thomas Kincaid?" "Yes. We have a warrant for your arrest." "For what?" His voice was a tremor, but not fear. Not yet. It was confusion. Then Laura spoke the name, for the murder of Hannah Whitford, Rockford, Illinois, December 12, 1986. In that moment, just a moment, the confusion in his eyes flickered into something else. Recognition. Memory. A shadow resurfacing. He didn't protest, didn't argue, didn't claim innocence. He simply whispered, "I knew this day would come." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the quiet street watched silently. And somewhere, 31 years late, justice took its first breath. The interrogation. A quiet confession. Kincaid sat in an interview room in Rockford, hands clasped, eyes unfocused. He looked like an ordinary old man, someone's grandfather, someone's neighbor, someone who shouldn't have been capable of darkness. But the DNA didn't lie. The evidence didn't lie, and neither did the guilt in his face. Laura pressed the recorder. "Tell me what happened to Hannah." A long pause, then a sigh. "I didn't know her," he said quietly. "Not personally." "But you followed her," Laura said. He nodded. "She seemed kind, alone, easy to approach." A cold shiver went through the room. "What happened that day?" Laura asked. "I saw her leave the library," he said. "I followed her. I only meant to talk. They always say that. They always rewrite the memory." She got scared. She tried to run. I grabbed her arm. She screamed. I panicked. Laura leaned in. "You strangled her." Tears formed in his eyes. He wasn't crying for Hannah. He was crying for himself. "Yes," he whispered. "I just wanted her to stop screaming. I didn't mean to." He cut himself off. Because meaning doesn't matter. Actions do. He confessed to dragging her body to his car, to driving to the bridge, to placing her where she was found, to driving away and starting a new life. That pretending he wasn't a killer. His last words in the interview were a whisper. "I thought, if I stayed quiet long enough, it would disappear." But truth doesn't disappear. It waits. The town reacts. Shock in the Midwest, Rockford erupted. People who remembered Hannah's smile sobbed when they heard. People who once feared the bridge trembled with anger. Parents held their children tighter. Old detectives cried quietly in their kitchens. The Whitford family, what remained of them, heard the news through trembling voices. Rachel broke into tears, not the loud, hysterical kind, but the quiet, collapsing sobs of someone grieving both the past and the years stolen by uncertainty. Daniel, Hannah's father, sat down slowly, put a hand over his mouth, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, God, thank you." The arrest of Thomas R. Kincaid spread through Rockford like a tremor, slow at first, then violently, shaking old memories loose and cracking open wounds the town had tried to bandage for 3 decades. Names were repeated in gas stations, whispered in grocery store aisles, murmured at church gatherings. Hannah Whitford. That poor girl, her killer, alive all this time. That man, living a normal life. How could anyone hide something like that? Some reacted with disbelief. Some with rage, some with tears, and some, people who had known Hannah personally, felt something else. Relief mixed with heartbreak, because closure often arrives carrying the weight of everything it took too long to reveal. The trial begins. The trial of Thomas Kinkade was scheduled for early spring. By then, the snow had melted from Rockford's sidewalks, but the cold lingered. It always lingered. The courthouse was packed every day, locals filling every bench staff, reporters filing every inch of hallway space. Some came because they remembered Hannah. Some came because they needed justice. Some came because they wanted, finally, to see the face of a monster. And some came because the truth had become part of the town's identity. Kinkade entered the courtroom in a plain gray suit. His hands trembled when he held the railing. Not because he felt guilt, but because life had finally stopped letting him hide. He avoided eye contact with the gallery, avoided looking at the Whitford family, avoided the prosecution table. But when he glanced to the side, just once, his eyes met with Detective Laura Merricks. He looked away immediately, because she wasn't staring at him with hatred. She was staring at him with understanding. Not sympathy, not softness, but the understanding that comes from seeing the truth in full, that some people choose darkness knowing exactly what they're doing. Prosecution unfolds the story. The prosecutor, sharp, calm, relentless, unfolded the case piece by piece. They began with the story of Hannah's final day, the torn sleeve, the bruises, the defensive wounds. Then the autopsy photographs were shown, briefly, respectfully, carefully. Even then, several people in the courtroom cried quietly, including a former librarian who had worked with Hannah. Someone gasped, someone whispered, "Oh God." Then came the forensics. Dr. Ian McConnell took the stand for nearly 3 hours, explaining step by step how the hair found on Hannah was preserved, how modern DNA extraction worked, how genetic genealogy built the family tree, how Kinkade's relatives unknowingly helped identify him, how his discarded tissue produced a perfect match. He spoke calmly, professionally, with a tone that made the science sound like both a miracle and a haunting inevitability. When he presented the final conclusion, "The DNA is an exact match," a murmur swept through the courtroom. Kinkade's attorney rose to object, weak objections, technicalities, challenges to the process, but nothing stuck. The evidence was too thorough, the science too advanced, the confession, partial but damning, too clear. The defense fails. Kinkade's attorney tried arguing that the DNA could be contamination, that genealogy was too new, that Kinkade was old, frail, not a threat, that he had lived an upright life since 1986. But none of it mattered. The prosecutor leaned forward and said the line that would later be repeated across Illinois. He lived quietly because Hannah could not. He lived freely because Hannah did not. And he lived without consequence because Hannah's family carried the burden for him. A silence fell across the room, heavy, still, thick with both grief and justice. The victim impact statements. The Whitford family had the chance to address the court before sentencing. Rachel, Hannah's sister, now in her late 40s, walked to the podium with trembling hands. She placed a folded paper in front of her, but barely looked at it. Her voice cracked on the first word. "My sister was kind. That's what everyone remembers. She was gentle, she was quiet, she was soft. She loved books and sunrises and sketching trees from the window." She swallowed hard, fighting tears. "She never hurt anyone, not once, and for 31 years we never knew why she was taken from us." She turned her gaze toward Kinkade. "You stole decades from her. From us. You stole her future, her family, the life she never got to live." Her voice shook. "But you did not steal our memory of her. You did not steal who she was. You did not erase her from this world, because I remember her. My father remembers her. And now the world remembers her too." Kinkade stared at the floor. He never looked at her once. Daniel Whitford, Hannah's father, didn't speak. He was too frail, too worn down by grief, too close to the edge of collapse. But when he placed his trembling hand on the podium and whispered, "Thank you," the courtroom erupted into silent tears. The sentence. Kinkade was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. He did not cry. He did not collapse. He did not shout. He only nodded. A slow, quiet nod. almost like acceptance, almost like resignation, almost like a man finally tired of running. As deputies escorted him out, one journalist later swore she heard him whisper, "I thought I could outlive it." But no one outlives truth. After the trial, the town heals. Rockford wasn't the same city after the trial, but it became a city that could breathe again. The Auburn Street Bridge was visited by locals, leaving flowers, candles, sketches, some drawn by children who never knew Hannah but heard her story. The library hung a small plaque near the children's section. In memory of Hannah Marie Whitford, 1966 to 1986, a light that never dimmed. Students at Rock Valley College created a mural dedicated to her. Blue hues, soft imagery, a silhouette of a young woman walking across a winter street. And the Whitford family, what was left of it, found something close to peace. Not healing, not fully, but peace. Rachel said she felt like she could finally exhale for the first time in 30 years. Her father, Daniel, spent his remaining years tending a small garden behind the house. He said the flowers made him feel closer to Hannah. He died quietly in 2021, a framed photo of his daughter on the bedside table. His last recorded words were, "I know now." The legacy of the case. The murder of Hannah Whitford became a landmark case in Illinois. Not because of the brutality, though it was brutal. Not because of the mystery, though it haunted thousands. But because it represented the profound intersection of old pain, new science, tireless investigators, and a family's refusal to be forgotten. Forensic genealogy programs expanded across the state. Cold case funding increased. Detectives from across the Midwest came to Rockford to learn from the method used to catch Kincaid. And at conferences, when Detective Laura Merrick explained the process, she always ended her presentations the same way. Hannah wasn't a case number. She wasn't an unsolved file. She was a girl with a future. And science finally gave her a voice. The final visit. Months after the case closed, Laura visited Hannah's grave alone. It was late afternoon, winter sun, long shadows, cold air that held no threat, only softness. She placed a small sketchbook, blank, brand new, beside the gravestone. "I thought you'd like this," she whispered. "Books were your world." She touched the top of the stone gently. "You're not forgotten." Then she stepped back, letting the silence settle, letting the wind move through the cemetery, letting Hannah's story become what it always should have been. A reminder of a life that mattered, a lesson in justice, a testament to truth, and a quiet promise that even in the deepest cold, light eventually returns.